October 27th, 1962. A single Soviet finger is seconds away from pressing a button that will vaporize the Atlantic Fleet and ignite the atmosphere. This is not a simulation. It is the moment the human race almost became extinct. Deep beneath the crushing weight of the Sargasso Sea, the hull of the Soviet submarine B-59 is screaming. Inside, the air is a toxic soup of carbon dioxide and sweat. The temperature has climbed past 120 degrees, and the crew is losing their minds. They are being hunted. Above them, American destroyers are dropping explosives, small signaling charges, but to the men trapped in that steel coffin, they sound like the end of the world. Captain Vasily Savitsky, delirious from heat and exhaustion, has reached a terrifying conclusion. He believes the war has already begun. He believes Moscow has been leveled. He orders the nuclear torpedo to be armed. A 10-kiloton warhead capable of turning the ocean into a boiling cauldron is slid into the tube. The only thing standing between the present and a global nuclear winter is a whispered argument between three men in a dark, airless room. The world above was blissfully unaware that it was living on borrowed time. The crisis did not announce itself with sirens. It arrived in a folder of grainy, black and white photographs. On a crisp October morning, an American U-2 spy plane had glided over the tropical canopy of San Cristobal, Cuba. The pilot wasn't looking for beauty, he was hunting for shadows. When those films were developed in a high-security darkroom in Washington, the analysts didn't see farm equipment or defensive outposts. They saw the unmistakable geometry of Soviet R-12 ballistic missiles. These were weapons designed for one thing: the decapitation of the United States. From these hidden sites, Soviet engines could deliver megatons of fire to Washington, D.C., New York, or Miami in less than 20 minutes. The American early warning system was rendered useless. The knife was already at the throat. President John F. Kennedy was handed these photographs while he was still in his bathrobe, a jarring contrast to the cosmic stakes of the information. The atmosphere in the White House didn't turn patriotic. It turned cold. For decades, the public was told a story of calm, visionary leadership. But the declassified tapes tell a darker story. The room was thick with the scent of desperation and the sound of fractured opinions. Kennedy's advisors, the Executive Committee or ExComm, were immediately split by a jagged line of ideology. On one side stood the military chiefs, the Hawks, who saw only one path: a massive preemptive airstrike followed by an invasion. They argued that any delay was a confession of weakness, a green light for the Soviet Union to tighten the noose around the neck of the free world. They were ready to burn Cuba to the ground, regardless of the consequences. On the other side of that table were men who felt the weight of the billions of lives hanging in the balance. They feared that the first American bomb to hit Cuban soil would trigger a chain reaction that no one could stop. If the U.S. struck Cuba, the Soviets would seize West Berlin. If Berlin fell, NATO would collapse. If NATO collapsed, the fingers would move to the red buttons. It was a domino effect, where every piece was made of enriched uranium. While the politicians debated in their soundproof bunkers, the machinery of war began to hum with a life of its own, moving faster than the men who supposedly controlled it. The system was taking over, a massive interconnected web of hair-trigger alerts and automated responses that left no room for human error. In the Kremlin, Nikita Khrushchev was playing a high-stakes gamble that had terrified even his own inner circle. He saw American missiles stationed in Turkey pointed at Moscow's heart and decided to balance the scales by placing his own daggers in the Caribbean. It was a game of nuclear chicken played at Mach speed. The fatal flaw in his logic was the assumption that he could maintain control over his commanders thousands of miles away. In a crisis of this magnitude, rationality is the first thing to evaporate. Communication was agonizingly slow. Telegrams took hours to translate and deliver, meaning the leaders were always reacting to a reality that had already changed. They were two blindfolded giants swinging sledgehammers in a glass room. Kennedy eventually chose a middle path, a naval quarantine. He avoided the word blockade because under international law, a blockade is a formal act of war. He hoped quarantine sounded more like a medical necessity, a way to stop the infection of nuclear warheads from reaching the island. But to the Soviet captains steering their cargo ships toward the American line, the semantics didn't matter. They were under orders to keep moving. On October 24th, the world held its breath as Soviet vessels approached the wall of American destroyers. The gap between them closed to miles, then hundreds of yards. In the Pentagon, the silence was so heavy, it felt physical. Then, at the final second, the Soviet ships slowed, shuddered, and turned back. Secretary of State Dean Rusk famously whispered, "We're eyeball to eyeball," and I think the other fellow just blinked. But the blinking of ships was a temporary reprieve, a mask for the true horror unfolding beneath the waves. While the world celebrated the ships turning back, 4 Soviet Foxtrot-class submarines were still prowling near the quarantine line. One of them, the B-59, was being relentlessly pursued by the USS Beale. The Americans began dropping practice depth charges, small explosives meant to signal the submarine to surface and identify itself. They had no idea they were harassing a boat armed with a nuclear-tipped torpedo. Inside the B-59, the conditions were a living nightmare. The air conditioning had failed days ago. The carbon dioxide levels were so high, the crew was fainting. The hull rattled with every explosion from above. They had been out of radio contact with Moscow for over a week. To Captain Savitsky, the muffled thuds of the depth charges weren't signals. They were the opening salvos of World War III. Savitsky ordered the nuclear torpedo to be readied for launch. This was the moment. The torpedo, once fired, would have vaporized the American carrier group and triggered an immediate full-scale nuclear retaliation from the United States. In the Soviet Navy, a nuclear launch required the unanimous consent of the 3 senior officers on board. Savitsky shouted his consent. The political officer, Ivan Maslenikov, gave his, but the third man, Vasily Arkhipov, stood his ground. In the dim, red emergency light of the control room, surrounded by dying men and the stench of diesel, Arkhipov argued. He insisted that the Americans were signaling, not attacking. He demanded they surface. A heated, desperate argument erupted as the hull continued to shake. It was a clash of wills that would decide the fate of every city on Earth. Arkhipov, through sheer force of character, eventually won. The B-59 surfaced, the torpedo stayed in its tube, and the world was allowed to keep spinning. As the sun rose on what would be called Black Saturday, the tension on the surface reached a new, lethal peak. An American U-2 plane, piloted by Rudolf Anderson, was tracked by Soviet radar over Cuba. Without direct orders from Khrushchev, a local Soviet commander made a fateful decision and fired a surface-to-air missile. The plane was shredded, and Anderson was killed. In Washington, the news was a lightning strike. The generals surged forward, demanding an immediate retaliatory strike. They were convinced the time for talk had ended. Kennedy was under immense pressure to authorize the bombing of the missile sites, an act that would have almost certainly triggered the very war he was trying to avoid. The fog of war had become a suffocating shroud. Simultaneously, a chaotic exchange of telegrams was flying between the White House and the Kremlin. Some messages from Khrushchev were conciliatory, almost pleading for a way out. Others, arriving hours later, were aggressive and demanding. It appeared as though the Soviet leader was losing control of his own military, or perhaps he was being deposed in a coup. The uncertainty was more terrifying than the missiles themselves. In the nuclear age, a misunderstanding is just as lethal as a deliberate attack. Every radar glitch, every stray plane, every nervous soldier with a rifle was a potential spark for the end of the world. The leaders were no longer driving the events, they were being dragged by them. The resolution finally came not through a grand summit, but through a desperate back-channel meeting in a small, nondescript restaurant. Robert Kennedy, the president's brother, met secretly with Soviet ambassador Anatoly Dobrynin. The deal they struck was a whispered compromise that both sides agreed to keep secret from the public for years. The Soviets would remove their missiles from Cuba, and in exchange, the United States would publicly pledge never to invade the island. But there was a second hidden half to the deal. The U.S. would also remove its Jupiter missiles from Turkey. It was a face-saving maneuver that allowed both leaders to retreat from the abyss without looking like they had surrendered to the enemy. It was diplomacy conducted in the shadows, fueled by the realization that they were both seconds away from losing everything. On the morning of October 28th, the announcement finally came over Radio Moscow. The missiles would be dismantled. The ships would return home. The fever that had gripped the planet for 13 days finally broke. People in cities across the globe stepped out of their homes, looking at the sky not for the blinding flash of 1,000 suns, but for the clouds. The crisis was over, but the world was forever changed. It had looked into the eyes of death and realized how fragile the entire structure of civilization truly was. The treaties, the hotlines, the chains of command, they were all just paper walls held up by the hope that the right person would be in the right place at the right time. Historians often frame the Cuban Missile Crisis as a masterpiece of calculated diplomacy, but a cold look at the declassified records suggests something much more unsettling. It was a miracle of pure, blind luck. There were dozens of points where a single panicked radar operator, a misinterpreted radio transmission, or a technical malfunction could have ended human history. We moved from a state of peace to the brink of extinction because of a few pieces of metal on a Caribbean island. And we only survived because a few men chose to doubt their own instincts. It was the moment humanity realized that the weapons we built to protect us had become our greatest threat. Today, the missiles from that era are rust and museum pieces, and the leaders who stood on that edge are long gone. Yet the shadows they cast remain. We live in a world where the response times are even shorter, the weapons are even more precise, and the systems are even more automated. The 13 days of 1962 serve as a haunting reminder that the balance of power is not a static state. It is a vibrating wire that we are all walking across every single day. We are told the world is stable, but history suggests that stability is often just a thin veil pulled over a state of permanent emergency. The silence that didn't happen in 1962 is the loudest warning we have ever received. We are still here not because the system worked perfectly, but because for one brief moment in the dark, a few exhausted men decided not to pull the trigger. The missiles were removed and the world breathed again, but the shadow never really left. Because we now know next time there might not be a Vasily Arkhipov to say no. The clock is always ticking, and the abyss is always waiting for us to blink.